So today I'm going to talk about civil rights legislation throughout time. To start off, first I have a couple definitions of what civil rights are. The first one is from dictionary.com, and it is the rights to full legal, social, and economic equality extended to all African Americans. And then my other one is rights to personal liberty established by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution and certain congressional acts, especially as applied to an individual or a minority group. And the first example I have of civil rights being in question is from 1857, and that is in the Dred Scott decision. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled to deny citizenship and constitutional rights to all African Americans, legally establishing the race as subordinate, inferior beings, whether slave or freedmen. Next, in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln freed all slaves in the Confederacy. Next comes the 13th Amendment, which was signed in 1865, and this abolished slavery. The first Civil Rights Act of 1866 invalidated black codes that previously existed in the South. Black codes were laws that were passed in the southern states to restrict African Americans' freedom and of compelling them to work in labor economy based on low wages or debt. The 14th Amendment, which was signed in 1868, granted due process and equal protection under the law to African Americans. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 granted blacks the right to vote. The next major court case was Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. This is where the term separate but equal comes in. The United States Supreme Court case that upheld racial segregation laws as long as the facilities were equal in quality. The first large sign of civil rights being fought for was the founding of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. They fought for the civil and political rights of African Americans, and it was started by 6 people. The civil rights movement started in the 1950s, where African Americans fought to eradicate the discrimination of them. The civil rights movement started with a landmark Supreme Court case called Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in 1954. In this case, the courts ruled that the segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It would be about 10 years before any more major legislation was passed. The 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, abolished the poll tax, which had originally been instituted in the 11 southern states. The poll tax made it very difficult for African Americans to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, religion, or national origin. Jim Crow laws were abolished all throughout the South with the Civil Rights Act. This would also lead to affirmative action. The following year, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. This made literacy tests, poll taxes, and other such requirements that were used to restrict African American voting illegal. The same year, Lyndon B. Johnson issued Executive Order 11246 to enforce affirmative action. 2 years later, in 1967, in Loving v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that prohibiting interracial marriage was unconstitutional. And in another Civil Rights Act, this one in the year 1968, it prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. This law was also signed by President Johnson. Today, people are still fighting multiple strong civil rights battles. The equality of racial rights is still being fought for so many years later. Same-sex marriage, universal health care, and the women's equality/pay gap are also being fought for. In women's equality, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 amended the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This created minimum wage and time and a half. It aimed to abolish wage disparity based on gender. The Equal Pay Act, passed in 2015, prohibited discrimination on the stance of sexual orientation or gender identity. It will be an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 where these topics were not addressed. In healthcare, the United States National Healthcare Act, or the Expand and Improve Medicaid for All Act, was a bill first brought to Congress in 2003 to address the need for healthcare for all with no discrimination. Probably the biggest fight being fought today is the same-sex marriage fight. And in 2013, in United States v. Windsor, it was clearly defined the wording in Section 3 of the Defense Against Marriage Act, which stated that union between strictly men and women was unconstitutional. In 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court ruled that in the 14th Amendment right for same-sex couples to be allowed to get married. The court also stated that states were not allowed to create any laws from restricting this action.